The aim of Japan's Siberian intervention between 1918 and 1922 was the dispatch of military forces to the Russian maritime provinces as part of a larger effort by Western powers and Japan to support White Russian forces against the Bolshevik Red Army during the Russian Civil War. In February of 1918, a Siberia Planning Committee was formed by the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff with the aim of exploring the possibility that the Tsarist collapse was an opportunity to free Japan from any future threat from Russia by detaching Siberia and forming an independent buffer state. The Japanese eventually deployed 70,000 troops, far more than any of the other Allied powers had anticipated. Japan's motives in the Siberian intervention were complex. The Japanese government's antipathy to communism and the perceived opportunity to settle the northern problem to Japan's advantage by either creating a buffer state or through outright territorial acquisition were all factors. However, after numerous Bolshevik victories in the Russian Civil War in June of 1922, Japan announced that it would withdraw from all of Russia, and the last Japanese soldiers left Vladivostok in October of 1922. But the General Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army did not give up. Under the umbrella term Operational Plan Number 8, they examined the possibility of an all-out war with the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. Against an expected 60 Soviet divisions, the Imperial Japanese Army would commit up to 50 of its own, delivered from China and from Japan. The ambitious plan examined the possibility of striking out into the vast steppe between the Great Khingan Mountains and Lake Baikal in the hopes of quickly cutting the Trans-Siberian Railway. Such a move, and the Japanese believed, would immediately isolate the whole region from European Russia. The scope of operations were enormous. The two sides would be engaged over a front nearly 5,000 kilometers in length, with Japan's final objectives being up to 1,200 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. In terms of distances, the plan would have dwarfed even Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Imperial General Headquarters concluded that to sustain a drive out to Lake Baikal, a fleet of some 200,000 motor vehicles and tanks would be necessary, more than twice as many as anything the entire Japanese army ever had at a given time. However, popular support for this concept finally dissipated in army circles after the 1939 Battle of Khalkhin Gol, a border crash between the two powers. The Soviets managed to outnumber the Japanese 2-1 in the battle and defeated them, forever putting an end to Japanese ambitions in Siberia and Mongolia. Particularly worthy of note that the Soviets brought about 500 tanks to the battle, Japan brought only 73. This was the fact that the Soviet Union had far more tanks than Japan. When the Japanese government met the news of Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka immediately argued that Japan should launch an attack in coordination with Germany. His views were supported by powerful elements of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. In late June of 1941, there was an Army and Navy conference during which the participants discussed how Japan should take advantage of the new strategic picture. As a result of this conference, a compromise was reached. The army would be allowed to make preparations to invade Siberia should the circumstances permit, but only if such preparations would not interfere with simultaneous planning for war in the south. All in all, the Army General Staff called for 22 divisions with 800,000 men, supported by 800,000 tons of shipping, to be made ready for the war. Ideally, the Soviets, in their scramble to throw all available forces against Hitler, would have also reduced the strength of their infantry forces in the Far East by half and their armored and air forces by 2/3, which would give the Japanese army a 2-to-1 superiority. The entire process was referred to by the acronym of Kantokuen, from Kantogun Tokushu Enshu, or Kwantung Army Special Maneuvers. The level of commitment was enormous and by far the single greatest mobilization in the history of the Japanese army. To facilitate the operation, a tremendous number of both combat and logistical assets would have to be dispatched to Manchuria on top of the existing structure. Additionally, port facilities, military housing, and hospitals were also to be augmented. Air power played a crucial role in the plan. Before the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Japanese intended to dispatch some 1,200 to 1,800 planes in 3 air divisions to bolster the existing 900 that were already in Manchuria, which would cooperate with about 350 Navy craft to launch a sudden and annihilating attack on Soviet Far East air forces at the outset of the hostilities. On the 1st of August 1941, the United States further sanctioned Japan by enacting a total oil embargo. Since American exports accounted for 80% of Japan's oil supply and most of the rest came from Dutch East Indies, which also refused to sell, the Japanese war machine was virtually cut off. This oil embargo proved to be the final nail in the coffin for Kantokuen. Scarcely a week later, on the 9th of August 1941, the Army General Staff finally bowed to the War Ministry as plans for the seizure of the resource-rich countries of the Southeast Asia were given top priority. With Kantokuen terminated halfway, the Japanese army found itself in the midst of a 180-degree turn in national policy. A total of 700,000 men remained in Manchuria, waiting for a golden opportunity for an attack on the Soviet Union, and continued operational preparations while examining the possibility of an offensive northward before the spring thaw of 1942. Over the next 3 years, the Japanese army would go on to oversee an exodus of combat units from Manchuria and set in motion a terminal decline that would eventually spell its demise. By January of 1945, the Kwantung Army had found itself reduced to a paltry 460,000 men in just 9 remaining divisions, and there were only 120 operational aircraft in all Manchuria. Worse still, the divisions that stayed behind were effectively ruined by transfer of men and equipment. Some infantry companies were left with only 1 or 2 officers, and entire artillery regiments completely lacked guns. Although by August of 1945 the Kwantung Army manpower had been bolstered to 710,000 by the exhaustion of local reserves, cannibalization of guards units, and transfers from China, its officers and men were privately in despair. Most of the new formation, staffed by civil servants and students, were at barely 15% combat effectiveness and heavily lacking in weapons. Simultaneously, Japanese intelligence watched helplessly as Soviet strength opposite them began to soar. Honoring his promise at Yalta to enter the war in the Pacific within 3 months of Germany's defeat, Joseph Stalin ordered the transfer from Europe to Far East of some 400,000 crack troops, along with 2,000 tanks and assault guns. These men and their commanders were specially picked because of their past experience in dealing with certain types of terrain and opposition during the war against Germany that would be beneficial for the approaching campaign. When the Soviets launched their general offensive at midnight on August 8th of 1945, the Japanese offered vicious resistance when they were allowed to stand and fight, but almost without exception they were overwhelmed and pushed back from the front. After just about a week of combat, reacting to Soviet declaration of war and the second nuclear strike on Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito overrode his military and ordered the surrender of Japan to the Allies. The Japanese army officially laid down its arms on the 17th of August 1945, with some sporadic clashes persisting until the end of the month. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you, and see you in the next video.